I'd like to go back to one of the earlier practices that you referenced, which is around investing in personal interests. I think we don't talk enough about that in the context of young children and purpose in their days and in their lives that's sort of initiated, directed by them. Can you tell us a bit more about that practice and its importance?
As a mom, this was a really fun chapter to write because I was thinking about my two very different children and what their interests are. And one of them, neither my husband nor I play baseball. And he just came out of the womb baseball obsessed. Anything baseball, like central to baseball, baseball adjacent, stadium history, and the like actual game of baseball. And I love actually tying this to your work and thinking about the role that books and literature have played, all different kinds of mediums actually for reading that have like kept him on a journey that has taken this role from like basic exposure to something to then being able to explore it in its fullness and sort of all of its different pathways. And now he's playing the game. So experience and expertise are developing. So when I think about personal interests, I was a prior pre-K teacher and fifth grade teacher. And so I always alliterate. Those E's are really important. So we think about in the early days, how do we simply expose young people to a real variety of things that they may or may not be interested in, and then give them space to be curious and to be open-minded. Said a different way, I have a friend who always talks about you can't be what you can't see. And so if kids aren't exposed to it, how could they possibly know if they're going to be interested in it or not? So taking this from a bookish perspective, my son showed some interest in stadiums. And we thought as the adults that he was going to be like an architect. He was like 3, right? So, but he really like dug in and he wanted kind of like kids with dinosaurs, anything that was around stadiums he wanted. And he went and he got all of the books that we could find at the library on it, and he would study and pour out of them. He still has them. They're like treasured possessions for him. And then that's what branched him out into baseball. And it was his own like personal self-discovery around that. It was this branching that just kind of happened, giving him space and time to not only be exposed, but to begin exploring. That then branched out into a love of all kinds of things, a love of Lego and building the actual stadiums, a love of fiction. There are some incredible fiction authors that write unbelievable stories about like going back in the past and future when it comes to baseball history. So he developed his first like love of authors, obviously the love of the game. He started playing it himself. And now it has moved into, he's in middle school now, he's 12. It's gotten kind of both broad and narrow. He's continuing to pursue the game of baseball. He still has those stadium books and baseball books, but he really likes commentary. He has a transistor radio, which lots of kids don't have these days. He listens to the broadcasting every single game. And because of my work, I've been able to be interviewed on the radio station that does the baseball broadcasts. And so we are looking to get him into the broadcasting booth. And so now as he gets older, it's kind of giving him all sorts of branches into possible lives that he could live.
And so all of those things sound like him following his interest. Can you give us some insight into, from the parent perspective, how do you support or facilitate the going from exposure to experience to exploration and beyond?
So I think I don't want to miss out on the opportunity of speaking directly to the work that you do and the role that any kind of medium of reading or research provides for kids in this space. So one way that we don't do it, and I'll talk about the don't and the do. I am of the mindset as somebody who's a developmentalist and I study well-being for a living that my kids can read and research whatever sparks their attention and gets them excited and jazzed, as long as it's appropriate. Remember, we're like going into the tween teen years, but I have never in my own house said, "Oh, that's not real reading," or "Oh, that's not a real interest. You can't explore that." When it comes to the early years, and I worked on nationally for workforce development for years. So I'm talking about this not only as a perspective of how do you raise kids, but for parents who might be worried about like career paths one day or success one day. It's a long way away for a lot of your listeners and viewers. Um, but it is following their lead. But back to like kids can't be what they can't see. We follow their lead, but we have to provide them with rich spaces that give them a chance to feel and see what they might be interested in. So they can only lead to what they know is possible. That's why libraries are such an incredible space, and giving kids enough time to go through the stacks and open the books, and really see, or like newsletters. Like I love that Scholastic or the Week Junior exposes kids to all of these articles and ideas and people that they might not otherwise have interest in. So I think holding a space for curiosity, bringing kids into environments that are rich and diverse in what they can see. And then the last piece that I'll add is that young people look for what Children's Defense Fund, their freedom schools talk about as windows and mirrors. So as our kids are exposed to things they might be interested in, it's really helpful if they can see people who look like them, who have that shared interest, whether that's racially, ability status wise, geographically, but can they see themselves as someone who could be an astronaut or could be a gardener or an athlete or whatever, who knows, whatever it could be. And then so that's the mirror. And then the windows are, can they be inspired by something that they wouldn't have otherwise ever known about, that gets them really fired up? Often we can see that with like wanting to change things, wanting to get involved in social issues, which can show up in early age.
Remind me, what was the third E? So we talked about exposure and exploration,
Yep. So exploration, then experimentation.
experimentation.
Yeah. So like really taking it from like, oh, I tried this a couple times to now like, I'm really going to do this for a while. And then eventually it's experience and expertise. So, the child decides soccer is my jam. Like I'm going for it and I'm going to keep I'm going to keep doing this, or writing is my jam. I'm going to keep doing this. So a lot of the E's kind of go together, but you've got the exposure, the exploration, which is still kind of wide and rangy. The experimentation is I'm starting to narrow in and like really try this thing for a while, or explore and read about this thing for a while. And then you get into that experience and expertise.
And can you talk about some of the settings or environments outside of the home that can support exploration, experimentation for children?
So I'm a real big believer that young people learn anytime and anywhere, and that we support them, that like learning is going to happen whenever it happens. And so we want to look at like, where are the learning rich spaces? And kids grow up in the context of all kinds of spaces and places where learning can happen. So learning happens in the home. It happens at school. It happens in community. And so when we think about the community spaces where learning can happen, there are formal ones and there are informal ones. So some of the formal community spaces could be community centers, could be places like museums and parks and libraries, can also be those activities that you enroll kids in. Those, like, I tend to think about the like extra, what we call like the extras. are often the most essential. So, a lot of the best learning, especially around kids' interests, happens in those extras that we enroll them in. The theater program that they're a part of, the music class that they take, the art class that they're able to do at the library or at the museum on the weekend. It sparks that interest and it keeps them going. So, community spaces are really important. And then, the other part of learning and where learning happens for our kids um, is online. That there is this opportunity, especially for folks who live in what we sometimes call like opportunity deserts, where it might be harder to get to a library, to a museum, to extracurricular activities for whatever reasons. That is where carefully, with your kid, guiding them to see videos or to read articles by using the internet can be a really powerful tool.
And I think we discovered that more through COVID, just all of that. I remember curating lists of, virtual museum tours or virtual tours of national parks, or it just seemed like there were probably resources that were available prior to that, but we weren't as intentional about seeking them out until we were trapped at home, and the internet was our only sort of connection point to places that we'd like to visit or experiences we'd like to have.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also a part there in terms of like how can kids create their own worlds where they can then kind of enact, or I'm looking at where I'm sitting, my boys' Lego worlds are just like 15 yards this way. And allowing them time back all the way back to play, like allowing them that downtime to kind of integrate what they have been exposed to, what they might be interested in, and to literally and figuratively like play it out.
I think it's such an important point that you're making about play and rest as a part of this learning and growing and developing process, because as parents, we forget about that. We're filling up days oftentimes with activities and um, experiences and exposure and all of the things that we talked about earlier. And you're right, there is that important piece of making sense of it all, figuring out how it applies to you, deciding what interest to pursue next, and just sort of sitting with it. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that. And I think that's a wonderful place to end our discussion today. Is there anything else that I haven't asked that you'd like to mention?
I would just bring us all the way back to the beginning of the conversation. We are in this unprecedented mental health crisis. And I think the power here is when we come in the door of well being and thriving with some of these practices, which include meeting basic needs like play and rest, and include allowing our kids to be exposed and explore things that interest them, things that feel really good and enjoyable. We not only support their health, including their mental health and healing, but their learning and development. And I think that that's really satisfying and like brings a ton of hope and optimism to what it means to parent kids in this particular moment in history.
Thank you so much for your time today and these wonderful insights.
Thanks, Maya.